centuries, an extraordinary war has raged across the world's oceans, above and below the waves.
You could kill hundreds of people with one broadside. These were extremely powerful war machines.
Shipbuilders designed bigger and faster vessels to outwit and crush their opponents.
That nation that has most powerful battleship fleet can destroy the enemy's battleship fleet and therefore control the seas. And if you control the seas, you control the world.
They carried terrifying weapons.
This was going to be the first time that somebody had fired a torpedo in anger since World War II. They needed to get it right.
But ships have also liberated and rescued thousands.
You can think of EP03 as basically a lifeboat for persons hunted by the Nazis.
And inspired men and women to acts of incredible bravery.
I will take you there now, to your cannons, to your death. We will sink before surrender.
These vessels and their crews have shaped world history.
As the commanding officer of a missile-carrying submarine, I was directly responsible for helping to prevent World War III.
This time, fighting across oceans as the world goes to war.
There was a loud hiss as the gun turrets hit cold North Sea because the gun turrets were hot. Very few people escaped.
Not one, but two world wars see technology race ahead, and once great warships rendered vulnerable.
It was a big victory for Germany, sinking a battleship, and to do it undetected was something of pure magic for the Germans.
But this is also a tale of heroic acts, daring seaborne missions that few thought would succeed.
And they were met with a scene that was likened to Dante's Inferno. Everything was on fire, even the sea itself.
As the Royal Navy entered the First World War, it could boast a whole century without defeat. Britain's position as the world's preeminent naval power was beyond doubt. But on May the 31st, 1916, the North Sea witnessed one of the greatest naval confrontations in history, the Battle of Jutland.
250 warships, British and German, deciding who rules the ocean and who's going to win the First World War.
But within minutes, the Royal Navy looks vulnerable. HMS Indefatigable suffers a direct hit. The subsequent explosion sent wreckage 200 feet into the air.
Her crew probably had been completely wiped out because when there's a massive magazine explosion, no armored doors and bulkheads will hold that back.
Just minutes later, HMS Queen Mary, the last battle cruiser built before the war, suffered a similar fate.
It was just a huge couple of 100 feet of dense black smoke, all kinds of bits and pieces, bodies, paperwork. There was a loud hiss as the gun turrets hit cold North Sea because the gun turrets were hot. Very few people escaped.
From his own ship, Admiral Sir David Beatty could merely watch. "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today," he muttered. And if the Germans won this battle, the war could be lost. But such a scenario had been unthinkable only a few years earlier.
Before the First World War, there was a naval building race between the British Empire and the German Empire, and the British won it. They produced more battleships and battle cruisers, the ships that mattered, than the Germans did.
Kick-starting the race in 1906 had been the Royal Navy's revolutionary HMS Dreadnought.
She has all big guns, so standardised armament. She's driven by turbine engines, which gives her a phenomenal speed. And she is a game changer. She raises the bar on battleship design. And all the ships that follow her become known as dreadnoughts.
By 1914, and the outbreak of war, Britain had 29 dreadnoughts to Germany's 17. And with control of the English Channel and a major naval base at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, the Royal Navy could contain the German Navy and prevent it from reaching the Atlantic.
So you have this German fleet, which is probably at the beginning 70% of the military value of the British fleet. But it can't do anything.
Since the start of the war, the British Grand Fleet in Scapa Flow had helped contain the Germans. It was commanded by Admiral Sir John Jellicoe.
John Jellicoe was a consummate professional, a very kind man, loved by his men, but a very quiet, sort of cerebral commander.
Jellicoe's massive dreadnought fleet had preserved Britain's maritime supremacy through the start of the war. To the south at Rosyth was a smaller but faster fleet led by battle cruisers under the command of Admiral Beatty.
Beatty was immensely charismatic, very good-looking, courageous, a great tactical commander. Nelson was his absolute hero.
By January 1916, these two very different men had a new foe. Across the North Sea, Admiral Reinhard Scheer was put in charge of the German High Seas Fleet. Scheer was dynamic and had a plan to tackle the all-powerful Royal Navy. Like the British at Rosyth, the Germans had a small but fast battlecruiser squadron. Scheer's plan was to use this squadron to lure small sections of the Royal Navy into combat. His battlecruisers, though, would quietly be followed by the full might of the High Seas Fleet.
They would try to trap part of the British fleet, perhaps the battlecruisers operating ahead of the main fleet, sink that, draw it onto the guns of the main German fleet, sink that, and this would even things up in strength.
On May the 31st, 1916, the Germans made their move. The battlecruiser fleet under Rear Admiral Franz von Hipper sailed north, with Scheer's main fleet 60 miles behind. In Britain, the Admiralty intercepted some German wireless communications, but they only found out about Hipper's departure from port. Their response was rapid. Jellicoe set sail from Scapa Flow, Beatty from Rosyth. On the afternoon of the 31st of May, it was the two battlecruiser fleets who spotted each other first.
When the German battlecruisers realized the British battlecruisers were present to the west of them, bit of a shock. They turned round and they headed back southwards. Rear Admiral Hipper was seeking the protection of Vice Admiral Scheer, and the British naturally turned south to follow them.
Beatty was acting in characteristically decisive fashion. Unaware, he was being lured into a trap. From the beginning, the German guns proved more accurate, and within 40 minutes, Beatty had lost 2 ships and 2,000 men. But the accuracy of the German gunners is not the only reason why the start of the Battle of Jutland was such a disaster for the Royal Navy. This is M33, a gunboat from the First World War. Its shell room is typical of the era, a store for explosive shells and the cordite charges that propelled them.
These things are volatile. They're extremely explosive, and they are stored in a dreadnought right down in the bowels of the ship, protected by the thickest armour, so it should be safe. What you find at the Battle of Jutland is that in order to speed up their rate of fire and compensate for their poor gunnery, the British battlecruiser fleet have started compromising with what today we call health and safety. They've started to take these cordite charges out of the fireproof cardboard cylinders. So there's a lot of this stuff lying around. And there is a hit on a turret, there is an explosion, and the flash from the fire races down inside to the cordite magazine and ignites this cordite in a catastrophic explosion, and the ship is destroyed in seconds.
Worse was to come, however, for as Admiral Beatty chased Hipper south, his lookouts had a shock.
The leading German fleet, Scheer's fleet, was seen coming over the horizon under a huge pall of black coal smoke.
Beatty had no idea the main German fleet were at sea. It was now his turn to do a full 180 and draw back to the support of Admiral Jellicoe. Only one vessel survives today from the Battle of Jutland. A light cruiser from Jellicoe's Grand Fleet. Her name is HMS Caroline. Thanks to her speed, Caroline carried out a specific role during operations such as Jutland.
This is Caroline's #1 engine room. She had 2 of these on board the ship. Caroline is still fitted with her 1914 state-of-the-art Parsons turbines. These turbines enabled Caroline to achieve a speed of up to 30 knots, which was essential for completing one of her key roles, namely to cruise ahead of the main battle fleet during cases like the Battle of Jutland and to protect the fleet from torpedo attack.
But because of their speed, it was cruisers that saw the bulk of the action at Jutland. As the main fleets came together, the British lost the cruisers HMS Invincible and HMS Defence. As evening approached, Jellicoe and his main battleships were finally in a position to engage. Having assessed the scene, the Admiral gave the most important order of his naval career. He instructed his dreadnoughts to form a long, continuous battle line across the path of the German ships.
The expression crossing the T is when one line of ships in the superior position is able to bring all its guns on all of its sides to bear, while an enemy line which is coming up to cross that T can only actually bring the guns that are at the front of the line and facing forward.
That is the decisive moment. Admiral Scheer comes up and sees the entire British fleet arrayed on the horizon. And at that point, Scheer knows that weight of shell calculation is there. He can't win this battle.
Faced with a 6-mile line of British battleships, Scheer ordered his ships to turn 180 degrees and head for home.
Basically, handbrake turns the battle fleet and the entire German fleet disappears into the mist.
But ever since 1916, debate has raged as to who actually won the Battle of Jutland. The German fleet had fled back to the continent, having lost 11 ships and 2,500 men. But the Royal Navy had lost 14 ships and 6,000 men.
British public expected something very, very different from this first major engagement on the seas. They expected, frankly, another Trafalgar.
It was a great disappointment to the British. In fact, when the ships came home, some of them were actually booed by dockyard workers because the Grand Fleet had not produced the victory that everybody thought it was going to. The Battle of Jutland actually gave a lot of confidence to the Germans.
In the days that followed, the Royal Navy put on a brave front. King George V honoured Britain's heroes. But the Germans too celebrated a victory. Despite the inconclusive result, Jellicoe's battleships had done enough to retain their status as the ultimate naval fighting machine. 3 years later, that enduring status would be demonstrated one last time in the final dramatic act of the First World War. On November the 21st, 1918, the east coast of Scotland was the setting for the biggest collection of naval power the world had ever seen. The German fleet and the Allied fleet faced each other. But this wasn't a battle, this was a surrender. This bizarre scene played out because 10 days after the armistice ceasefire was signed, 250 Allied ships were tasked with escorting the German high seas fleet into British waters. It had been agreed that whilst peace talks continued in Paris, the German fleet would be interned at the natural harbour of Scapa Flow in the Orkneys. But the Allies were taking no chances and came with their guns loaded.
The ships themselves, there was a possibility they could be taken to neutral zones like Norway or Sweden to decide what was going to happen with the division or dividing up of the German high seas fleet for different countries. But using Scapa Flow would be an area that could be well protected against the possibility of escape in a sheltered harbour and also used by the British Grand Fleet base.
The 74 German ships anchored in the northwest corner of the flow, under the command of Rear Admiral Ludwig von Reuter. He wrote in his report, "Velos, airlos, disarmed, dishonoured." Norway and Sweden refused to provide a neutral port. So 4,500 German sailors spent the winter on board their ships in Scapa Flow. Food supplies did arrive from Germany, supplemented by fish caught in the flow. But communication with the outside world was infrequent.
The commanding officer, Admiral von Reuter, is not really being kept abreast with the peace negotiations, but the German fleet is, without a shadow of doubt, being used as a bargaining tool in those peace negotiations. So Admiral von Reuter doesn't know really what's going on, but he fully expects that the German fleet will be seized and divvied up among the Allied forces as the Treaty of Versailles is signed.
The British saw Reuter as a reasonable man. In reality, he had no intention of letting his fleet be handed over to the Allies.
He has no firepower, he can't fight. The ships are not the fighting machines they had been 7 months earlier, having been left to rot over a winter in Orkney. And so the last remaining act of war open to him, his only option to stop that happening is to sink them.
For 4 whole months, Admiral Reuter quietly formulated plans to scuttle his own fleet. But German warships were designed with watertight compartments. The Seydlitz had fought at Jutland and been hit 20 times by shells, yet it remained afloat. So German crews in Scapa Flow took to drilling holes through the bulkheads. They welded watertight doors ajar and started leaving portholes deliberately open. By the end of May, it was clear that the terms of the Versailles Treaty would mean either the seizure or the destruction of the German fleet. So Reuter made his move.
He gives the order on the 21st of June by sending a signal, a pre-arranged signalling flags up his mast. Now that can be seen by the next ship, which can be seen by the next ship, and they copy that and so on and so forth, and that's how they get the message around, which is to open everything up, start them sinking and abandon ship.
To scuttle a vessel, the way the Germans would have done it is they would have opened the seacocks and valves and smashed the internal water pipes to start flooding the internal compartments.
One by one, the pride of the German Navy began to sink. Some capsized, some settled on the seabed, some plunged headlong in a roar of steam. From the shoreline and nearby British ships, locals and naval staff alike watched as the German sailors took to their lifeboats.
The British Marines actually tried to stop them by firing upon these sailors. And unfortunately, 9 of the German sailors were shot dead by British Marines.
The bodies were buried on the nearby island of Hoy, the last casualties of the Great War. And of the 74 ships interned, 50 were successfully scuttled. The seabed of Scapa Flow became home to 400,000 tons of German steel warship. Emily Turton regularly dives down to the wrecks.
They don't feel spooky and creepy and sinister or just incredibly sad like it does when you dive on a war grave. But I think the sheer size of them can be intimidating. But they're not spooky. They can be moody, but they're not spooky. There are parts that look very ship-shaped, but parts that don't. And yes, there are huge natural reefs. I think we are very lucky with the German ships in that, especially the dreadnoughts, they're so heavily built. Some of the steel on there is 14 inches thick, that they're going to see me out quite happily.
The German determination to scuttle their own battleships showed that these mighty vessels were still the flagships of the fleet. But 20 years later, at the start of the Second World War, the German Navy planned a vengeful attack on the Orkneys, one that would prove how times were changing. The attack would demonstrate the deadly effectiveness of a single German submarine, a notorious U-boat. It would strike at the heart of the British home fleet in their safe haven of Scapa Flow. The man given this almost suicidal task was 31-year-old Gunter Preen, the commander of U-47. He'd sunk 3 British merchant ships in the first month of the war, And now, he would do his homework, studying the weaknesses of Scapa Flow.
So weather barriers now block the eastern approaches to Scapa Flow. During the First World War and the start of the Second World War, those are narrow channels where the tide screams in and out of Scapa Flow. Now the British Navy thought they were well protected because they've sunk ships all higgledy-piggledy across those waterways.
On the evening of October the 13th, U-47 slowly approached Kirk Sound on the surface and passed between two block ships, a gap that was just 50 feet wide. "We are in Scapa Flow," Preen wrote excitedly in the sub's log.
After breaching Kirk Sound, U-boat 47 made her way into the grand anchorage of Scapa Flow in search for targets. They spotted the Revenge-class battleship silhouette of HMS Royal Oak lying at anchor in Scapa Bay.
Royal Oak is a First World War dreadnought. But she was in Scapa Flow, still part of the British fleet, and she's anchored right over to the east of Scapa Flow, and I believe it was so her guns could offer some protection to a radar station that was over on the cliffs over on the east side of Scapa Flow.
Asleep on the Royal Oak were her experienced crew, but also a complement of 120 trainee sailors, all teenagers. From a distance of 2 miles, Preen fired 3 torpedoes at the unsuspecting battleship. 2 of them missed, 1 exploded, but only in the vicinity of the Royal Oak's anchor chains.
According to HMS Royal Oak, some of the survivors, they thought it might have been the inflammable stores igniting or exploding. And this thing had apparently happened before, so they went back to sleep in their bunks.
Preen edged his U-boat closer and fired again.
By this time it was too late. A final 3 salvo of torpedoes was fired at HMS Royal Oak. 3 minutes later, all hit in quick succession amidships. HMS Royal Oak was doomed. It would have been absolute chaos and confusion. Over 1,230 men on board. Men screaming, smoke filling the inner chambers, cordite magazines ignited and asphyxiating the men. Flash fires, horrendous. And all this going on while the ship was slowly sinking to the starboard side.
"He's finished," Preen said, as he watched from his U-boat's conning tower. Across the bay, the Royal Oak sank beneath the waves. 834 men and boys lost their lives. Kinley is heading for the site of the wreck. The boat's echo sounder shows the hull of the battleship, just 8 meters below.
So Royal Oak is right under us. We're still leaking fuel oil to this day, and the oil itself that disperses on the surface is known locally as the tears of the oak. The buoy represents the final resting place of HMS Royal Oak, and it represents those who lost their lives here on that fateful early morning, and every year we commemorate that.
Mission accomplished. Gunter Preen and U-47 made their escape.
I think the most amazing thing is after that ship has gone down, he still then manages to get out of Scapa Flow and away, and he's hailed a war hero in Germany.
Sinking a battleship at the first part of the Second World War was a huge success, and to do it undetected was something of pure magic for the Germans.
U-47's audacious attack had proved that a single U-boat could sink a mighty battleship. And in the years to come, it paved the way for U-boats to take center stage in the longest battle of the war. In the Second World War, the fight for control of the seas would once again mean the difference between victory and defeat. A key battleground was the Atlantic Ocean.
The Battle of the Atlantic starts on the 3rd of September 1939, and it finishes on VE Day, May 1945. It never stops.
The Battle of the Atlantic was one of the key sort of things that Churchill in later life said kept him up at night. The worry that failure would result in the loss of those vital supplies, the inability to feed the population and the inability to prosecute war in Europe.
The Germans, understandably, have worked out that for an island nation like Britain, everything it needs has to come in ships. If you stop the ships arriving, Britain has no food, so it starves. It has no raw materials, so it can't make anything. Its economy collapses, and it will surrender. You don't need to invade.
The Germans' main weapon in the Atlantic was the formidable U-boat.
Tactically, the Germans would tend to put a whole number of U-boats out into the North Atlantic, and they'd spread them at various points, some close into America, some close into Britain, but others out in the middle, and they'd stretch a line of U-boats across the area that they would expect convoys to travel through. When a U-boat spotted a convoy, it would signal the German High Command, and they would start to assemble what they called a wolf pack, bringing large numbers of submarines together ahead of the predicted convoy course.
By now, it was clear massive battleships were vulnerable to U-boat attacks. Convoys, it was concluded, needed protection from smaller, faster ships, loaded with the latest technology. It was the coming of age of the destroyer. Today, there is just one surviving British destroyer from the Battle of the Atlantic, HMS Cavalier. In 1944, Cavalier's first operations were to protect larger warships and merchant ships in the Atlantic.
A destroyer is quite a specialised fleet unit. They're designed for speed and hitting power. They have no armour and no protection. Their speed is their protection.
They were able to move from one side of the convoy to the other with great speed, and increasingly were used as hunter-killer groups aimed specifically at trying to destroy German U-boats.
Their primary weapon was the depth charge, a high explosive dropped from the ship and set to detonate at a specific depth. But it had its limitations.
You had to run over the target to be able to launch weapons against it. And submarine captains were pretty canny about trying to make sure they weren't run over.
As the war developed, it was realised destroyers needed to be able to target German U-boats without passing right over them.
This led to the development of Hedgehog, which is basically a mortar, and it's firing a very large, heavy projectile across the top of the ship and down sort of trajectory that then enters the water in front of the bows.
In Churchill's words, the war at sea became a matter of seamanship and science. New shortwave radar sets were introduced that could detect U-boats as soon as they broke the surface. And the formation of Atlantic convoys themselves was studied in detail. Churchill was advised that losses in the Atlantic could be reduced by growing the size of each convoy, by increasing its speed, and by boosting the number of close escort ships. It's believed this led to a 60% reduction in vessels lost. Another breakthrough for the Royal Navy came via the code breakers at Bletchley Park, who fed the Admiralty vital information on U-boat movements.
The way the Germans controlled their ships through the Wolfpack system was all about communicating back to the submarine command. If you know where that particular place is and where they're gathering through signals intelligence, then you can target them.
The human cost on both sides of the Battle of the Atlantic was high. Over 700 U-boats destroyed. Nearly 3,000 Allied ships lost. Those figures could have been higher, however, were it not for Britain's determination to target the enemy's biggest battleship. 2 years into the war, they devised a plan that would remove the threat of the mighty Tirpitz. But the plan was so outlandish, few thought it could succeed. Winston Churchill was in no doubt about the threat posed by the Tirpitz. The whole strategy of the war turns at this period, on this ship, he said. Tirpitz had the potential to wreak havoc on merchant shipping in the Atlantic. But to do that, it would need to transfer from its base in Norway to a service port with direct access to the ocean convoys. The only dry dock big enough was at Saint-Nazaire in France. The Normandy dock was 400 yards long.
The Normandy dock was not only huge, but it had the facilities. It's quite a specific task to repair a battleship of that size and of that nature. And here they had all those facilities. They had the engineering and the dry dock facilities with which they could carry that out.
If the British could destroy the Normandy dock, then the mighty Tirpitz would be rendered useless in the Battle of the Atlantic. But in 1942, Saint-Nazaire was a well-defended German naval base with a string of bomb-proof U-boat pens. Attacking the Normandy dry dock would be far from easy. Bombing would be too inaccurate. The estuary was well guarded by anti-submarine nets, and a land attack through German-occupied France was simply impossible. The task of pulling off the impossible fell to the specialist team at Combined Operations Headquarters. Their plan would see a flotilla load of commandos dispatched to destroy the watertight gate of the dock, known as the caisson. The commandos would then swarm ashore to destroy the equipment that controlled the dock. At the heart of the flotilla would be an old American warship from the First World War, renamed HMS Campbelltown.
The Campbelltown was one of the 50 lease-lend destroyers that were transferred to the Royal Navy by the Americans, and it started life as a USS Buchanan. It was altered in a very short time at Devonport Dockyard to make it look like a German Merva-class destroyer.
2 of its 4 funnels were removed, and the remaining 2 were cut at an angle in the hope of convincing German lookouts that one of their own ships was approaching. Much of the superstructure was then removed to enable Campbelltown to pass over the shallow mudflats of the Loire estuary. But most importantly, Campbelltown was turned into a floating bomb, a bomb that would ram the Normandy dock.
The charging Campbelltown was placed just behind the mounting for the forward gun, which would be the first point of resistance when it rammed the caisson. It consisted of 24 Mark 7 depth charges, linked together with special fuses which operated with copper wire and acid, and they were quite experimental.
The Campbelltown sailed from Falmouth on the 26th of March 1942, along with 18 motor launches and torpedo boats. On board were 260 commandos. This was the most daring of raids, and many of the men were sure they wouldn't be returning home. And yet Lieutenant Commander Sam Beattie held a sherry party for his officers. Could their old warship dupe the Germans and strike a major blow in the Battle of the Atlantic? They would know in just a few hours. In March 1942, an old First World War destroyer sailed from Falmouth to the German-held French port of Saint-Nazaire. Its mission: to destroy the only Atlantic dock big enough to service the fearsome German battleship, Tirpitz. HMS Campbelltown and its flotilla entered the Loire estuary around midnight on the 28th of March. Under the command of Robert Ryder, the floating bomb approached Saint-Nazaire in darkness.
They had to employ certain tricks to make sure that they weren't recognized. The most obvious one, of course, was the transformation of the Campbelltown. But Ryder had other tricks up his sleeve. They had liberated the German naval code book, and so they knew what all the codes for the Saint-Nazaire area were. And on the motor gunboat was a signalman who could signal in German and answer the challenges from on shore.
The trick worked until the flotilla was just a mile from the dock. From then on, Lieutenant Commander Sam Beattie had to steer Campbelltown under a barrage of German gunfire.
What we're seeing behind me is the old mole on which you can see the lighthouse, which gave Beattie his aiming point. He was to pass about 100 yards off that and carry on past. Part of the difficulty here is that on the old mole was a searchlight position and also a very dangerous gun.
But as the clock passed 1:34 a.m., the ship rounded the old mole, increased her speed to 20 knots, and crashed headlong into the Normandy dock gate.
The Campbelltown has impaled herself upon the caisson here to such an extent that her bow projected 3 feet in front of the inner face. Her forecastle stands 12 feet above us.
The assault parties immediately began clambering off the front end. It was quite a game climbing down the ladder as there was a fire blazing in the forecastle. Corporal Calloway's trousers caught fire as he was climbing down, and he had to take them off. He carried out the whole operation in his underpants.
There was one party for the southern winding house here, one for the pump house, and one for the northern winding house at the far end of the dockyard.
With the onboard bomb set to explode at dawn, the Campbelltown element of the mission was shaping up to be a huge success. But for the rest of the flotilla, it was a different story. Under intense enemy fire, very few of the motor launches ever made it to land. And when the Campbelltown commandos rendezvoused at the Old Mole as planned, they discovered there would be no boats to take them home.
It was the first time they realized, when they got there, what had happened to the launches. And they were met with a scene that was likened to Dante's Inferno. Everything was on fire, even the sea itself.
As dawn broke, most of the commandos on shore had been captured. And there was another problem. The bomb on board Campbelltown had failed to detonate. To make matters worse, German troops and sightseers were now climbing all over the beached enemy vessel.
The following morning, Lieutenant Commander Beatty, who had been rescued from the river, was being interrogated by German officers. And they were saying to him, "You British must be stupid if you think you can destroy our dock with that flimsy destroyer."
Just at that moment, she went up. Beatty smiled at the officer and said, "We're not quite as foolish as you think."
The raid on Saint-Nazaire was a success after all, but it came at a cost. Of the 611 men involved, only 228 returned to Britain.
There is no doubt that when one considers the distance that the force had to travel to get here, what they faced when they got here, and to put the Campbelltown within an inch of its target within 4 minutes of its projected time, without doubt justifies the label of the greatest raid of all.
The Tirpitz never did come into the Atlantic, and the once all-powerful battleship was now shown to be vulnerable, both from submarines and from an attack as cunning as the raid on Saint-Nazaire. A few weeks later, though, a clash took place on the other side of the world, which threatened to make the battleship completely obsolete. On June the 5th, 1942, the US Navy won a stunning victory in the Pacific at the Battle of Midway. It was a battle fought and won by aircraft carriers. The US lost one carrier, the USS Yorktown, but American aircraft destroyed 4 Japanese carriers. It was a sea change moment in the history of combat ships.
The assumption when they were laid down was that battleships would be the key to the fleet, and aircraft carriers would serve to protect them and guide them and mark the fall of the shot and report, that was long or that was short. Instead, the roles were completely reversed. Aircraft carriers were the principal striking force of navies by 1943.
Yet battleships were still being built, like this one that put to sea a few weeks before Midway, the USS Massachusetts.
So this is a floating city, a floating town, which has its high street, it has its prison and a fire service, it has the gunnery office, it has the bakery, it has a post office. Well, it's America afloat because it's a crew of 2,000 volunteers, all coming together from all walks of life, all levels of society, from a Kentucky farm boy who'd never seen the ocean to the Harvard yachtsman.
Impressive though she was, the Massachusetts role was unclear. But her first taste of war would be significant and help create a new role for the battleship. In October 1942, she sailed to support an amphibious invasion of North Africa. 3 task forces invaded French Morocco and Algeria, on November the 8th. Operation Torch's objective was to remove the German and Italian forces from the region. The Massachusetts supported the landings at Casablanca, bombarding shore defences. But in the port, another battleship was waiting for her. The Jean Bart was an unfinished stationary French vessel, with a crew allied to the German forces.
She was a very credible threat. She was being built, but she still had guns on board. And so this match, backwards and forwards, started with the Jean Bart. The ship was about 13 miles off the coast. The range of our guns is 22 miles, something like that. Shell is about the weight of a Toyota Corolla.
5 of the Massachusetts' massive 16-inch shells hit the Jean Bart, the first causing extensive damage.
And here you can see the Jean Bart. This is a photograph taken after the battle ended. You can see where one of the shells penetrated the hull and exploded in the magazine. When the shell exploded, the deck actually folded over the aft turret.
Meanwhile, the Massachusetts became known as a lucky ship, and with good reason. A shell from the Jean Bart scored a direct hit.
Above us, you can see the hole that the shell made, the patch that was put on it. It was cut out, and the shell came in through here and exploded in this compartment. Now, there was nobody in this compartment because everybody was at action stations. But if we look at the deck, we can see dents into the 5.3-inch steel deck. In the bulkheads or walls, we can see patches that were done at the time of holes where the splinters of the shell punched through to the other compartments. Very luckily, nobody was in this compartment when it went off.
And the success of the Massachusetts as an offshore gun battery became the blueprint for other battleships. Amphibious invasions in the Pacific and on D-Day would see battleships taking a new role.
They're being used for shore bombardment, they're being used as floating artillery by 1944-45.
The battleships engaged more in ship-to-shore operations, sort of softening up the islands so that the heads of the enemy would be kept down so the Marines could go in and land on the beaches, relatively unimposed.
Over 2 world wars and 30 years, the battleship had gone from being the key naval vessel to little more than a support role. Size, strength, and firepower had been usurped by speed, technology, and the ability to wage war above and below the surface. And in the form of the aircraft carrier, World War II had introduced a new star vessel, one that would keep combat ships at the heart of modern warfare.